In the chaos of World War II, a soldier's life often depended on the rifle in his hands or the grenade on his belt. But when the fighting moved into the claustrophobic terror of a trench or the frozen mud of a foxhole, there was one tool that many soldiers feared more than a bayonet: the shovel. Specifically, the German Klappspaten. To the untrained eye, it was just a tool for digging holes, but to the soldiers on the Eastern Front, it was a masterpiece of engineering designed to transform instantly from a spade into a lethal, close-quarters battle axe. The United States Army saw this weapon and tried to clone it. They copied the blade. They copied the handle. They copied the fold. They spent millions of dollars retooling factories to mass produce it for the invasion of Europe. But they missed the single most important component: the lock. Because of a basic misunderstanding of metallurgy, the American version didn't just fail to dig, it failed to kill. It became a liability that froze in the winter and seized up in the summer. Today, we're going to uncover the story of the Galling disaster. We're going to look at the microscopic mistake that turned the U.S. Army's favorite tool into a death trap, and how a $2 difference in materials separated the survivors from the casualties. This is the story of how America stole the perfect design, but forgot to steal the science that made it work. The trench nightmare. To understand why a locking nut matters so much, we first have to understand the desperation of the men who carried these tools. When the United States entered World War II, the standard issue entrenching tool was the M1910. It was a relic. It was a T-handled spade, essentially a miniature version of what you might use in your garden today. The M1910 was designed for the static warfare of World War I. In that war, armies marched to a line, dug a massive trench system, and stayed there for weeks or months. You didn't need speed, you needed durability. A solid piece of wood and steel was fine. But World War II changed the physics of combat. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war. By 1942, the war had become mechanized and airborne. Soldiers were jumping out of C-47 transport planes. They were cramming into jeeps, gliders, and half-tracks. Every inch of space on a soldier's body was calculated real estate. The U.S. commanders began to receive reports from the field. Soldiers were ditching their shovels. They were throwing them into ditches or sawing off the handles just to make them carryable. The Ordnance Department realized they were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tools. They needed something compact, something that could vanish when not in use, but appear instantly when a soldier needed to dig in under fire. They looked at their own designs and found nothing. Then they looked at the enemy, the German blueprint. The German Wehrmacht had solved this problem back in 1938. Their solution was the Klappspaten, literally the folding spade. It was a marvel of geometric efficiency. The blade folded back 180 degrees to rest flat against the handle. It took half the space of the American shovel. It sat high on the hip, out of the way of the legs. If he locked the shovel at 90 degrees, it suddenly became a killing instrument. Specifically, the German shovel could lock at a 90-degree angle. This setting changed everything. It allowed the soldier to use the tool as a heavy-duty pickaxe to break up hard, rocky ground. In the frozen earth of Russia, this was essential. You would break the ground with the pick setting and then lock it straight to shovel the dirt out. But darker yet, this 90-degree lock turned the heavy steel blade into a devastating weapon. In hand-to-hand combat, a rifle is long and clumsy. A knife has no reach. But a folding shovel, locked at a right angle, acts like a medieval war hammer. You could hook an enemy's shield, hook their rifle, or strike with terrifying force over the top of a helmet. To make this work, however, the locking mechanism had to be bomb-proof. It had to hold that heavy steel blade rigid even when striking rock or bone. If the lock failed, the blade would flop around, injuring the user. The Germans achieved this rigidity with a massive threaded collar. It was the heart of the system. The U.S. engineers were impressed. They took captured German shovels to the Aberdeen Proving Ground and dissected them. They decided to reverse engineer the design immediately. The American copy. In 1943, the Ordnance Department finalized the design for the M1943 entrenching tool. On the surface, it was a clone. If you hold a 1943 German shovel and a 1943 American shovel side by side, the geometry is almost indistinguishable. The blade shape, the hinge point, the folding mechanism. It was a direct copyright infringement. But the American engineers couldn't resist tinkering. They were under immense pressure to conserve strategic materials. Steel was needed for tanks, battleships, and artillery shells. They were also under orders to reduce the weight of the infantryman's load. They looked at the locking nut on the German shovel. It was heavy. It was thick. The Americans thought, we can do better. We can modernize this. So they made a decision that looked brilliant on a blueprint, but would prove fatal in the field. They cast the locking nut out of aluminum. On paper, this was a great idea. Aluminum is lightweight. It doesn't rust. It was the wonder metal of the aviation age. Factories across the United States began churning them out by the millions, and the M1943 was issued to GIs, paratroopers, and Marines. They carried it into the humid jungles of the Pacific and the hedgerows of Normandy. And almost immediately, the reports started coming back. The shovels were failing. Why did they fail? If you read the old field reports, the soldiers simply said the aluminum nuts were soft. They said the threads stripped out. But that is a simplification. The problem wasn't softness. You can make aluminum alloys that are incredibly hard. The real culprit was a phenomenon in physics known as galling. This is the part of the story that most history books skip, but it is the key to the entire disaster. The M1943 shovel used a steel bolt, the shaft of the handle, and an aluminum nut. These are two dissimilar metals. Aluminum is a highly reactive metal. In the atmosphere, it instantly forms a thin, invisible skin called aluminum oxide. This skin is what protects it, but it is very thin. Now, imagine a soldier in a foxhole. He is terrified. Mortars are falling. He needs to lock his shovel immediately. He grabs that aluminum nut and cranks it as hard as he can. He is pumping adrenaline, applying massive torque to the mechanism. Under that high pressure, the protective oxide layer on the aluminum threads shatters. Now you have raw, bare aluminum rubbing against raw, bare steel. The friction generates intense localized heat. At a microscopic level, the aluminum molecules literally tear out of the nut and fuse to the steel bolt. This is called cold welding. The metal isn't just stuck, it has become one solid object. The more this soldier tries to force it, the more he destroys the threads, creating a jagged, welded mess of metal shavings that jam the entire mechanism. Once a fastener has galled, it is usually impossible to remove without cutting it off. Imagine that happening in the field. You are under fire. You try to twist your shovel, and the two metals weld themselves together halfway down the thread. The blade is stuck at a useless 45-degree angle. You can't dig with it. You can't fold it back up to put it in your pack. You are effectively disarmed of your survival tool by invisible friction welding. the frozen hell. But if the friction didn't get you, the temperature would. As the war dragged into the winter of 1944, the U.S. Army found itself in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. Temperatures dropped to record lows. This is where the second failure of the American aluminum nut appeared: thermal conductivity. Aluminum is an incredible conductor of heat. That means it draws heat away from anything it touches instantly. In 0-degree weather, that aluminum nut became a heat sink. If a soldier, in the panic of combat, took off his wet glove to adjust the nut, the moisture on his skin would instantly freeze to the metal. It's the tongue on the flagpole effect, but in a combat zone. Touching that aluminum nut was painful. Adjusting it was impossible. Furthermore, there is the issue of thermal expansion. All metals shrink when they get cold, but they shrink at different rates. Aluminum shrinks roughly twice as much as steel for every degree the temperature drops. As the temperature in the Ardennes plummeted, the aluminum nut shrank tighter onto the steel threads than the steel itself. Even if the nut wasn't gold, the cold would clamp it down with thousands of pounds of force. The U.S. shovel was effectively paralyzed by the weather. Soldiers found themselves hacking at the frozen ground with shovels that wouldn't lock, risking broken fingers every time the blade collapsed. The Nazi secret. So how did the Germans avoid this? Did they use higher quality steel? Did they have better lubricants? No, they used plastic.
While the Americans were experimenting with aluminum, the Germans had already solved this problem years earlier, using a material called Bakelite. Bakelite was the world's first fully synthetic plastic. It is a thermosetting phenol formaldehyde resin. To modern ears, plastic sounds cheap. We think of disposable water bottles. But Bakelite is different. It is hard, dense, and incredibly resistant to heat and chemicals. The German engineers chose Bakelite for the locking collar not because it was cheaper, but because it was superior. Here is why the German plastic shovel won the engineering war. First, no galling. Bakelite is a polymer. It cannot friction weld to steel. No matter how hard a German soldier tightened that nut, or how much dirt and grit got inside the threads, it would never, ever seize. It was self-lubricating. A German soldier could torque that nut down with all his strength, knowing it would release smoothly when he needed to fold it. Second, it is an insulator. Bakelite does not conduct heat or cold. A soldier could grab the Bakelite ring in sub-zero temperatures with bare hands, and it would feel neutral. It wouldn't freeze to his skin. It didn't turn into a block of ice. Third, dimensional stability. It doesn't shrink or expand significantly with temperature changes. It worked in the burning sands of North Africa with the Afrika Korps, and it worked in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. The Germans didn't just build a shovel. They built a tool that understood the physics of the environment. The Americans built a copy that looked right, but ignored the chemistry. The weaponization factor. This brings us back to the title of our story, The Weapon. Because the German Bakelite nut could be tightened securely without seizing, the Germans could rely on that 90-degree lock. They trusted it. The Wehrmacht actually developed training manuals for using the Klappspaten as a melee weapon. With the blade locked at 90 degrees, it was perfectly balanced. It could hook an opponent's leg. It could pry open a door. It could split a helmet. The American GI, however, could not trust his lock. If he swung his M1943, the aluminum nut might slip. The blade would collapse. Using the M1943 as a weapon was a gamble with your own life. If you swung at an enemy and the blade folded back, you were defenseless. This reality created a strange phenomenon on the battlefield. In many memoirs and oral histories, veterans of the European theatre describe scavenging the battlefield. They weren't looking for souvenirs. They were looking for shovels. If an American soldier found a German Klappspaten, he would often throw his brand-new US government-issued aluminum shovel into the mud and clip the Nazi shovel to his belt. It wasn't unpatriotic, it was survival. They knew the enemy plastic would actually work when the shelling started. The United States eventually learned the lesson, but it wasn't too late for the war in Europe. It wasn't until the Korean War era, with the introduction of the M1951 entrenching tool, that the design was truly fixed. The M1951 kept the folding concept, but it added a dedicated pickaxe spike. And crucially, the engineers abandoned the aluminum experiment. The locking nut on the M1951 was made of steel. They accepted the extra weight to ensure reliability. The M1943 remains a fascinating piece of history. It is a monument to the dangers of arrogance in engineering. The US Army saw the shape of the future, but they didn't understand the science that held it together. They underestimated the enemy's material science. They didn't understand that a $2 plastic ring was the difference between a versatile weapon and a piece of junk. In the end, thousands of American soldiers paid the price for a metallurgical oversight. They learned the hard way that when the world freezes over, you don't want the lightest shovel. You want the one that opens. This has been a look into the hidden engineering failures of World War II. If you want to see more about how small design flaws caused massive military disasters, be sure to subscribe.